Now, as we've seen, the war with Iran is also hitting the financial sector. Tehran has declared it'll go after US and Israel's regional economic centers after one of its own banks was targeted in a strike. This as oil prices continue to skyrocket, sparking fears of a recession. Lloyd Blankfein knows about navigating times of great uncertainty. As the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, he led the company through the 2008 financial crisis. His new memoir, Streetwise, looks back on his humble beginnings and his rise to the top of the career ladder. He shares his reflections with Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, John and Lloyd Blankfein. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Walter. Happy to be here.
In your great new memoir, Streetwise, you talk about 17, 18 years ago, the great financial crisis, how you got Goldman Sachs through it. But you also say we're due for another one, maybe. And you talk about kindling, being on the ground, and a spark could set it off. Is $90 barrel oil and $4 of gasoline at the pump, is that the spark that could set it off?
You know, I don't think so. But one never thinks so. That's the nature of a spark. You know, the point is we haven't had a reckoning for a long time, which to me means the discipline that one applies after you have a crisis stays with you for a while, and then it starts to ebb over time. And usually the crisis of the century in financial markets happens like every 4 or 5 years. But this has been an exceptional period. We haven't had it for a while. So usually discipline relaxes. Assets appear on people's balance sheets. At some point, there has to be kind of a reckoning, and the longer it takes, sometimes the worse it is. Now, what by spark, I mean, sometimes there's a triggering event that if the kindling wasn't on the floor of the forest, it would have just passed unnoticed. But as you build up all these things, maybe something comes along that triggers it. The nature of a bubble, the nature of a spark is that you don't always predict when it is, so it's hard to tell. But I don't think so. The war itself, which $90 may be a part of, could be it in the long run. But again, I don't necessarily think so. That's not my base case. In fact, the very severity of the situation means that it's not going to be borne for a long time, which means one way or another, this situation won't be allowed to pertain. And by the way, it's not $90 oil. $90 oil. If this does pertain for a long time, you may be talking about $130 oil.
And what would happen if you got to $130 a barrel for oil?
Well, it raises very difficult questions for people because something like that is just all bad all around. Because higher oil prices, when it seeps into the supply chain is inflationary on the one hand and kind of recessionary on the other hand as the cost burdens rise for people. And so, you know, the most dreaded term, if you're a central banker, is probably stagflation, which means the two aspects that you're supposed to accomplish, and usually they're in opposition to each other, are on the same wrong side. Higher inflation and higher and lower growth together is a kind of a very, very bad situation. What do? Do you try to remedy the inflation part by raising rates, or do you try to remedy the low GDP side by lowering rates in response to the crisis? And so that's a very poor situation to be in, and one tries to avoid that.
You know, there's been about 4% growth in the economy in the past, but half of that does seem to be from AI infrastructure, and the complex investments. How much does that worry you?
Well, I'm in the worry business. I've always been in the worry business. I think it's something to be concerned about, but I think if you ask me what my base case is, I think it's absolutely terrific. I know there's a lot of concern about AI, whether the expenditures will be justified by the revenue. There's a lot of concern about AI because there's a worry that it'll reduce employment in the country. Look, first of all, once the genie's out of the bottle, it's like you can't unlearn stuff. So we're going to go forward with this, so we might as well reconcile to it. But on the whole, I can't be negative about anything that's making everyone more productive. I understand there'll be dislocation in the short term, Maybe there'll be a lot of software jobs that AI can do very, very efficiently without the numbers of people that have dedicated themselves to learning that. There'll be dislocation. They'll have to learn other things, get retrained. Maybe some people won't be able to be retrained, and the political sector will have to deal with the ramifications of that. It'll be up to the political sector to smooth out the difficulties and see that incremental wealth that gets created gets distributed in a way consistent with our values.
You title your book Streetwise, and I think it sort of has a double meaning the really rough street you grew up on in Brooklyn, and then, of course, Wall Street happens. But let me start in Brooklyn. You grew up in a housing project, a school that's pretty unsafe. You're scared to go to the bathroom at times, and yet you call that chapter, I think you call it Advantages. What were the advantages?
Well, there's some irony in that name. I did grow up in public housing. I did go to a high school that they shut down shortly after I left as a failed high school because not very many people were graduating. And I would say the advantages of that are low expectations by me and of me and for me. And so it was also produced a lot of motivation to get out. And frankly, that my earliest motivation that I can recall, nobody in my family and even my sibling hadn't gone to college. And I didn't know anybody. None of the parents that I knew of other kids went to white collar. In fact, I didn't remember anybody having a suit. Very blue collar. Not necessarily that different from, a lot of people. It was very motivating. It was very motivating.
Well, wait, so how did you get to Harvard?
The thing that I was reaching for, the carrot that I was reaching for was to go to an out-of-town school. And I wasn't contemplating an Ivy League school. Frankly, I wasn't even sure, I can't even recall whether I even knew what that was. But I did go to a college night at a high school in a nicer neighborhood. I went in, nobody was checking IDs. There was no metal detector in those days getting into New York City public schools. And I went in and there were various booths, and I crossed a booth that was occupied by, I thought it was a grown-up. It was probably a young guy, but to me, it looked like an old guy. And he was from Harvard. There were other people there from other Ivy League schools. I took an application from him. We chatted. He couldn't have been nicer. And I think I filled out that application like you'd fill out a landing form if you got off an airplane. In other words, I didn't, there were questions and I wrote answers to them. I didn't approach it like I would a test today, knowing what I know today. And somehow they took me, which is why I'm always great. By the way, I didn't get into every school, but I did get into that one, and that was a good one to get into. And it was culture shock when I get there. I'm not sure it was a great place for me to go, given the adjustments I had to make. But I'll tell you, it was a great place to have gone for all the doors that got opened to you. But by the time I was done with 4 years, I should have started then. I was then prepared to first get into Harvard as a result of my 4 years there. But there was some, acculturation and difficulty. But I label it advantages because I don't know. I didn't have to source my motivation. I know a lot of, obviously at this point in my life, I know a lot of comfortable and wealthy people who have kids, and there's a lot of to be or not to be anxiety about what should I do. And those are people who have choices. I didn't really have a choice. It was go forward. If somebody paid me 25 cents an hour more than another person, I took that job. I wasn't sitting there wringing my hands about fulfillment and who am I and where do I want to go with this. There's some advantages to having no choice.
You talk about your dad being a mail sorter in the book, and there's a wonderful scene when he retires and there's a machine wrapped in plastic behind him, which is a machine that can sort the mail better. What did you think at that moment when you saw the machine that could replace what your father had done?
By then, when my father was retiring, by then I was, I may have even been in graduate school at that point. So I'd gone on and I'd seen more of the world. I'd never seen his place of business, but I knew, he sat with a battery of people sorting mail. My dad would always, at home, he would practice that. He knew the name of every village. This is even pre-zip code. Every village in Connecticut and he would memorize these so he could sort the mail. And I never saw it, and he was retiring, and so we snuck into the post office. I don't think they have the apparatus for having, going away parties in the in that part of the government. And he went in, saw his colleagues. Was there only not that long, but I said hello to this one and that one, and I turned around. I said, "What is this big hunk of metal behind them that seemed to still be wrapped up?" And it was an electronic mail sorter that would have done everything efficiently, quicker, never make a mistake. And they just kept it there because it was the government. They didn't lay people off, which is, by the way, why my father liked that job, because earlier in his life he had been in private sector and had been laid off and looked for a job. But what a soul-crushing thing that must be, to be doing your job in front of a machine that could have done it much better, faster, mistake-free. I kind of felt sad for my dad.
When I listen to you talk about your dad, it makes me think of a really large question we sometimes don't ask, which is, what is the purpose of an economy? And some people would say, like ourselves, maybe it's to create wealth and to create growth. But others might say, no, it's to create dignity. It's to create a good society.
What the economy has to do is two things. It has to create wealth, and a good economy has to distribute that wealth in a sensible way, in a fair way, according to the values of that community. I would say at this point, we have done a very good job of creating wealth. We're the biggest economy in the world. Usually, size and bigness is the enemy of sprightliness and speed and resilience. And yet our economy, which may have been the ground zero for a lot of problems, no one recovers faster or realizes their mistakes quicker and reallocates investment dollars to more productive things. And so we're very good at creating wealth. But at the same time, it's been poor in distributing in that, because the wealth that has been created has been mostly because of the accretion in value of asset prices. So people with assets are getting richer, and those without assets are at best standing still, but they're not getting wealthier because they don't have the assets that are growing in value. So the gap between the richer and the not rich is expanding, and it's creating the polarization that we see in the economy that's also has infiltrated the political economy and the politics of our country. So both of those aspects are true. So I would say and I say the latter part is more a function for the political sector to figure out how to distribute. Obviously.
Okay, so what would you do to have wealth inequality reduced if you were in the political sector?
Well, obviously the way to do that always is to increase the things that get distributed for free. It could be healthcare, it could be childcare, it could be education, for younger kids that some people pay for, but that otherwise could be something that's just distributed. You pay for that by a progressive system. The people who don't have big incomes don't pay a lot of taxes, and the people who have big incomes. And I think most people are for that. And a lot of the debate that takes place that's antagonistic to that is not so much antagonistic to the progressivity of the system, but whether in fact there's waste and we're spending money on stupid things or inefficiently on things. I think it's appropriate to look at a lot of stuff that we've been paying for a long time, that a lot of bureaucracy has been built upon. And maybe, you don't know what you could do without till you try to do it. And I'd be forgiving if the government did some things and had a reverse course because we decided that some things that were identified as wasteful or unnecessary turned out to be more valuable than we thought. But I think that has to be done. And while you're doing that, I think what has to be done is raising the minimum standard of living for people who don't have resources and adding stuff to it by paying for that with a more progressive tax system.
Including healthcare?
Yes, even healthcare. I think that people will rail against the system, and maybe it's worth railing about. I'm not an expert on how on Obamacare or the things, and we certainly are spending a lot more money for healthcare than other countries at a percent of our much higher GDP, and don't necessarily have the results to show it. Yes, including healthcare.
You talk about how the inequalities of wealth that comes from great asset growth and the booming economy, but leaving people behind, has led to a populist backlash. But part of that, too, comes out of the crisis you write about in the book, the 2008 financial crisis, that there was a perception, and perhaps a reality, that the banks got bailed out, average person didn't. Tell me what you think the ramifications of that were.
Well, certainly it contributed to a sense of things being unfair and things being rigged. And, in fact, the banks that accumulated lots of bad assets kind of went under, and the people who were responsible for those banks at the end of the day lost a lot of value. But at the end of the day, government doesn't lend money to people, and the central bank doesn't lend money to the system. The banking system does. And because the banking system was in distress, any money you put into the banks were husbanded and kept and retained by the banks, because they had to increase, by the way, by regulation, they had to increase their reserves that were lost and had become exhausted. So the reason why the financial crisis and the recession that resulted from it lasted so long was because it was also a banking crisis. And the instrumentality by which individuals get reached and the economy gets stimulated was under stress. And that's why that recession lasted quite a long time.
You talk about being an outsider, feeling like a real outsider at Harvard. Did you feel like a real outsider the whole time you were running Goldman Sachs?
I said, I started writing that book at a point at which my life in East New York, Brooklyn was a quarter of my life. And yet that quarter, your early childhood, again, I'm not a lot of things, and I'm not a child development psychiatrist, but I could tell you, but I am a father and grandfather, and I see kids. I think you get stamped at a very early age in a certain kind of way. Those tendencies in you get formed. You can lean against them, but you never are without them. And so I was stamped a bit as somebody who'd walk into a room and be very, very aware that I was different from other people and what that meant. And coming on from the wrong side of the track, my natural empathy is, look, I get into a car and there's a driver in front. And then when I get upstairs, I wonder, oh my gosh, what's he doing with his time? And did he have lunch? And it makes you think a certain kind of way. And my identification is going to be born out of those life experiences. And it's just a very funny thing. Those life experiences at a very early age get stamped indelibly on you, and they are on me. So the answer, that was a long-winded answer saying yes, even though I could be the CEO of the company and still walk into a room and know that, gee, I'm a little less polished than these people. I'm a little less this and a little more of that than these people. And that's a little bit of a that remains a preoccupation for your whole life. I'll take it to my grave.
Lloyd Blankfein, thank you for joining us.
Walter, thank you very much. And I appreciate, I always love talking to you. Thank you.